Tonight we're going to be entering into chapter 29 of Isaiah. I have the first 4 verses titled A Summary of the Woe. And he begins in verse 1, Woe to Ariel, the city where David dwelt. Add ye year to year, let them kill sacrifices. And I guess the first question is, who or what is an Ariel?
Outskirts of Jerusalem, the extreme outskirts, 5 miles from Jerusalem, is Bethlehem, where David dwelt.
Now, David dwelt in Jerusalem.
Yeah, I know, but he was in Bethlehem when Samuel come over there and included his 8 brothers.
He still dwelt in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
This is referring to Jerusalem. Ariel would be symbolic for Jerusalem or Zion. And the question is, what does it mean, though? Why is it being used? Paul mentioned that some commentators say that it refers to the altar. That is one of the ideas that the term itself means. Or as one put it, the heart of God. If you look at, someone turn over to Ezekiel chapter 43 and read verse 15. Okay. Same word, but translated altar here. So that you might have been curious as to why that verse. Well, it's the same word as Ariel translated here. There, though, it's translated altar. Others believe that it refers to or means the Lion of God. So you have, they're not really sure what it means. There's these 2 ideas, the Lion of God or the hearth or the altar of God. It's going to be a Jerusalem, whatever it means.
It wouldn't relate to anything with Christ being the Lion of the tribe of Judah. That wouldn't be any connection at all, possible?
Probably not having reference to Christ. As it really would not fit as to what he says, for example, in verse 2, Yet I will distress Ariel. There shall be heaviness and sorrow, and it shall be unto me as Ariel. Doesn't really fit Jesus. But among commentators, some of them are adamant one way, some of them the other way. I don't know and could not say other than what, here's what the experts say it means, one way or the other. So we'll take it from both standpoints. Make it easy. If it is the Lion of God, then it could very well express that Jerusalem had been invincible at one time and sees itself as a lion. During David's day, they were pretty much invincible. They were the ones who went out and conquered. They were not being conquered. And so they would have been feared and revered by all nations. That's the way they viewed themselves. Remember in New Testament times, the Jews said, "We've never been in bondage to anyone." Well, it's almost a laughable statement, but that's the way they viewed themselves, though. They were in bondage at that time under Roman subjection. And the very idea in their mind of a Messiah was what? Someone to deliver them from that bondage. But yet they would still cry, "We've never been in bondage to anyone." The way that we view ourselves a lot of times is a lot different than what it is. One of the hardest things, I guess, to do is to look at yourself or self-evaluation, because you look at yourself, as we put, with rose-colored eyes or glasses. And so that's kind of the way they looked at themselves. We are invincible. We are the Lion of God. Feared by all nations, invincible. Nobody can defeat us.
Sound like Isaiah's use of sarcasm here. Not very veiled.
Not so much sarcasm as using metaphorical language to describe them. If it is the hearth of God, though, or the altar of God, it would indicate the place where sacrifices and feast, or if sacrifices were offered and where they observed the feast. Someone turn back to Deuteronomy, the 12th chapter, and read verse 5, and then verses 11 through 12, or through 13. Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 5.
But unto the place which the Lord your God shall choose out of all your tribes to put his name there, even unto his habitation shall ye seek, and thither thou shalt come.
Okay, so here's the place where God's going to choose out, they're going to seek and come. Skip down to verses 11 through verse 13 now.
Then there shall be a place which the Lord your God shall choose to cause his name to dwell there. Thither shall ye bring all that I command you, your burnt offerings and your sacrifices, your tithes and the heap offering of your hand, and all your choice vows, which ye vow unto the Lord. And ye shall rejoice before the Lord your God, ye and your sons and your daughters and your men servants and your maid servants, and the Levite that is within your gates, forasmuch as he hath no part nor inheritance with you. Take heed to thyself that thou offer not thy burnt offerings in every place that thou seest.
Okay, so here's all of this. He goes through your burnt offerings, sacrifices, tithes, heave offerings, all your choice vows. These are the things that would be taking place in that city that God has chosen. If you turn over a few chapters to chapter 16 of Deuteronomy, verse 2 tells us much the same thing. Thou shalt therefore sacrifice the Passover unto the Lord thy God of the flock and the herd in the place which the Lord shall choose to place his name there. So again, here's Jerusalem, and he refers specifically now to the Passover. So here's all of these sacrifices, the offerings, and all of these things that are going to be offering at Jerusalem. Thus, the altar of God. You were trying to get me to say it, I know, and mess up, but even as a lot of times the capital city represents a nation, Jerusalem represented the nation. But specifically here, he would be dealing with Jerusalem, the city. And this is where all of the people would come to offer the sacrifices and offerings and all of these other things as instructed by God, because that's the city that God had chosen. And so it is the city where David dwelt. And that is literally where he pitched his tent or encamped. David pitched his tent in Jerusalem. Isaiah seems to be saying in this, just keep on doing what you're now doing, with your regular sacrifices, and the destruction will indeed come. The idea of year to year might be saying that the ensuing siege that's going to come upon them will fall within the next year. So within a year, this siege, this destruction that we see is going to come upon you. Homer Haley suggested that, quote, the content of the chapter justify a broader meaning, suggesting that as year is added to year, and the cycle of feast rolls around not once but any number of times, Jehovah will bring Ariel low, but eventually bless her. If, as many commentators think, Isaiah has Sennacherib's invasion in mind, the former is preferable. But the content of the chapter seems to point to the total period from Isaiah to the coming of the Messiah, in which case the second view is preferable. So here's this year to year, adding year, cycle of feast rolls around. But God is going to eventually bless her, and that is by the coming Messiah. Edward Young summarizes the verse in this way: Ariel, you are the very city in which David once had made his dwelling. But you, Ariel, are in a precarious position. Woe to you! You refuse to realize your true condition. But you will soon discover that your present security is no security at all. Go on, therefore, as you have been doing. Add year to year, for you think that your present condition will continue indefinitely. Celebrate your feast regularly, year by year, as you have been doing. It will be of no avail. Basically, Israel could not see their true spiritual condition. Isaiah is pointing it out to them. They don't realize any problem. Look at the Jews of the first century, even with Christ, and the scathing rebukes he gave unto the people of that day. Did they believe him? Did they believe him that when in Matthew 22, the latter part of the chapter, that, behold, your house is left unto you desolate? Did they think it was going to be desolate? And then in chapter 3, that's the latter part of chapter 23. And then in chapter 24, there's the look at the temple, not one stone will be left upon another. Did the Jews believe that? Not a chance. They didn't believe it. Now why? Because they had rejected the Messiah. As Stephen put it in his sermon to the Sanhedrin, as your fathers have done, so have you. You're stiff-necked and uncircumcised of heart and mind. So,
Paul tried to give us a hint at the end of Romans 2 when he says he is not a Jew, which is one outwardly, and the circumcision is not outward, but it's in the heart. And he tried to hint that their outward observances wouldn't bless them, but they didn't take the hint. And 13, 14 years later, after Romans, their city their stones get leveled everywhere. Everybody died, except for a small remnant at Petra that leaves and runs from the hill.
he does set forth the spiritual aspect of what a Jew is. That it is not one that's outward Jew, but one inwardly. But he doesn't specifically deal with their destruction. Jesus did. Not one stone left upon another. Did they believe it? No. Why? Because they could not see their spiritual condition. As we've gone through these 28 chapters of Isaiah, how many times does Isaiah reveal to them their spiritual condition? Just time after time after time. And some of the, again, scathing terms that he uses. And yet, did they accept what he said? Did they believe it? No. And so, when first Sennacherib comes, while God delivers them from Sennacherib's invasion, now then just think, here's their mindset is, we're invincible. Nobody can harm us. We're God's chosen people. And then when Sennacherib's invasion comes and God destroys or kills 185,000 of the Assyrians in one night, what would you be thinking? Just adds to that thought, doesn't it? And yet, they never really repented. In a sense, and understand how I'm using this. So in a sense, why should they? They're God's chosen people. God's blessing them. Why do they need to change? Could we make an application to today? America, so prosperous. We're invincible. And all of these same ideas that apparently the Israelites had back there. And in reality, because of the spiritual condition, will be destroyed unless something, repentance takes place. the Zionist and the premillennialist still hold that view. Don't mess with the Jews. That the success of any nation is tied directly to whether or not they support Israel. That is what they teach. And so if we don't support Israel, then we will not prosper. We'll be destroyed. If we support Israel, then God's going to bless us. I got news for them. It doesn't work that way. Our success or failure as a nation is based upon righteousness. Remember what Solomon would state? Righteousness does what? Exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. Pam? That would be true. Of course, they think of it as physical Israel, but you're right. The church is the Israel of God today. It's sad to say, a lot of times, even Christians don't support the church the way that they should.
What's that verse where he says, make it like a dish, turning it upside down? And he uses that in his prayer sometimes, and makes me think that America
Hosea, I remember, uses the term cake not turned.
Yeah.
But I don't remember of a dish in that sense.
He uses it in his prayer, and I know it's a verse that actually exists in the prophet somewhere.
I'm not saying it doesn't. I'm just saying I don't remember it.
But it says in Proverbs 16 and 18, and I forget the verse, but arrogance and lack of humility and overplayed view yourself is very dangerous. That's where our country has in a lot of places circles.
Well, that's kind of what we're talking about, arrogance, that we are invincible, that we're... how many times have you heard the idea being presented, America is a Christian nation? No, it's not, of course, but we should understand that at least. But how many people believe that? Doesn't matter how we live or how people live, what they do, the sins that they're involved in, the total promotion of the most vile and ungodly sins. We're still a Christian nation, right? No. Okay. But seeing our own spiritual condition a lot of times is the most difficult thing. I think you have to guard against it from an individual standpoint, but a lot of times we can see it in others. How many people, even members of the Lord's church that are talking about now, think that they're going to be saved when in reality they're not? They're lost because they cannot see their own spiritual condition. They think that they love God, but in reality their actions show otherwise. They think that they put God first, but they don't. And how many times does the scriptures say, be not deceived? In other words, you can be deceived about things. You can be deceived by your own self. Self-deception is the worst type. Israel was a lot that way. And Jerusalem here. Just go on, continue with your sacrifices. You think everything's going to be fine. And in reality, that gets us to verse 2, yet I will distress Ariel, and there shall be heaviness and sorrow, and it shall be unto me as Ariel. So God is going to distress them. Even though here they are, we're offering the sacrifices. One of the things that the prophets had to fight against is, and it's called religious externalism. They were going through the externals that God required. For example, here, offering the sacrifices. And they thought that made everything all right. Look, we're offering the sacrifices that God commanded. So everything must be okay, right? No. Today it's, well, look, I attend services. Surely everything's all right. I'm going to go to heaven. And, I partake of the Lord's Supper on Sunday, and I might enter into the singing. If, somebody put their ear up to my mouth, they might hear me. Being a little facetious there, but we go through the externals, so we must be all right. And that's part of the problems here. We're offering the sacrifices. Everything must be okay. No, God says, I'm going to distress them. Even though they are going through the externals.
Matthew 13, 41 through 43, an extra prophet says, he'll gather out of his kingdom all things that offend and do iniquity, cast them into a furnace of fire, and weeping and gnashing of teeth will occur.
All of those things, all those in the kingdom that are offending. Heard someone say, this was years ago, and it made an impression on me. When Jesus preached the Sermon on the Mount, who was he preaching to? Well, he was preaching to the Jews, God's chosen people. Yet, and I know it applies to all of us today, but the specific people he was preaching to were the Jews. And yet he would say that the majority would be lost. That the majority of the Jews were going to be lost? Yeah. And yeah. Of course, Jesus, and while he was alive, it was purely to the Jews, the lost sheep of the house of Israel. How many of them repented? Very few. And yet they all considered themselves saved. We're children of Abraham. Pam? if you look at, you do, but just to further that, look at the denominational world. If you go up to anyone who's a member of a denomination, you going to heaven? What are you going to get? Well, sure I am.
Some of them will be skeptical. Well, I don't really know yet.
You get that from a lot of members of the church. I hope so. But look at those how many, and I know it's not as much as what it used to be, but how many believe in God and yet they never attend the service of any religious group? If you ask them, are you going to heaven? Invariably, they're going to say yes. Self-deception. They can't see it. You try and teach them, and because of that self-deception, it becomes difficult. Yeah, don't need it anymore. I'm all right. Self-deception. In this verse, God makes, he leaves no doubt that he is the one that's doing this. I will distress them. It shall be as unto me as an Ariel. God is doing it, but he's using a nation to do it. And so he's saying again, go on with your sacrifices, but he has prepared his own sacrifice, Ariel, or Jerusalem. That's the sacrifice that God's going to make. And as you can tell, this all kind of harmonizes with the idea of it, the word Ariel being the altar or the hearth of God. That they go ahead with your sacrifices, you're the ones who are going to be sacrificed on God's altar. And the city where David dwelt is going to be in ashes, is basically the idea. The people in the city will be bemoaning their situation. In the Hebrew, there's a play on words here that really cannot be reproduced in English. That's true when you translate from one language to another. Another good illustration of something that we don't see in English, but in the Hebrew it becomes very obvious, is the 119th Psalm. Now, some of you, in most Bibles, it gives after every 8 verses the next Hebrew letter. If you want to learn the Hebrew alphabet, look at 119th Psalm and then you'll learn the Hebrew alphabet. But how many of you know that every verse in that section starts with that first letter? Or the first letter is that, for example, the first 8 verses, Aleph. All of them start with an Aleph. The next 8 verses, Beth. Well, every verse starts with Beth. In English, as it's translated, you never know that. You have the same thing with Greek. Sometimes there's a play on Greek words, but you translate it and that play on words is lost. That's the case here as well. That they are going to be in heaviness and sorrow, that it shall be unto them as Ariel, or unto him, unto God as Ariel. This must take place before there can be a true altar of God, hearth of God. The spiritual filthiness and immoral dross has to be purged from Jerusalem. Now then, spiritually it is in the church. From a physical standpoint in regards to Israel, in one sense it never was. As far as idolatry, though, after we returned from the Babylonian captivity in 536, the Israelites never worshiped idols again. They eliminated that. Did they live right? No. But the idolatry that was seen prior to that time was done away with. David had made Jerusalem a great city. And that is seen obviously when Solomon goes to build the temple. Who prepared all of the stuff for the building of the temple? David did. He made it a great city. Untold wealth. But now then, it was filled with idols. Someone turn back to Isaiah chapter 2 and read verse 8. Isaiah 2 and verse 8. So here they are. Land's full of idols. Wasn't supposed to be. Were they supposed to make idols? Of course not. What about idols of God? Representations of God. Were they supposed to do that? No, that was forbidden as well. But now then, the land's full of it, and they're worshiping, as he puts it, the work of their own hands, that which their fingers had made. David made it a great city. Here's what it is now. Land filled with idols. Ahaz had defiled the temple and set up one pattern after the one in Damascus. In 2 Kings chapter 16, in verses 10 and verse 11, it says, "And King Ahaz went to Damascus to meet Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, and saw an altar that was in Damascus. And King Ahaz sent unto Urijah the priest the fashion of the altar and the pattern of it, according to all the workmanship thereof. And Urijah the priest built an altar according to all that King Ahaz had sent from Damascus. So Urijah the priest made it against King Ahaz, came from Damascus." So here's Ahaz going to Damascus to meet with Tiglath-Pileser. And what takes place? He sees their altar to their God. Sends the pattern back to the priest, Urijah, and says, "Make the altar like this." And sure enough, Elijah does exactly that. We come down to the time of Isaiah. While Ahaz, he did prophesy in Ahaz's time. Hezekiah, he was a good king. And he brought about a reformation. But in the reformation that Hezekiah brought, he never changed the heart of the people. The condition of their heart was still the same before Hezekiah's reform as it was after as it was before. There's no change in them. They continued in that idolatry, even though he killed all the priests and tore down the altars. Their hearts were not changed.
It says in 4:2 and following, and 10:20, 23, there was a remnant that did change. There was a really small minority that changed.
Okay, there's always going to be the remnant, but from the standpoint of the people, you can talk about the remnant, that's the exception. That's not the rule. The rule was the people, their heart wasn't changed. And thus, as you read Isaiah, you read very little about Hezekiah's reform. Hezekiah had his heart changed. Yeah. But the people's didn't.
Same way in Josiah's day, after again.
Same thing under those. Well, Josiah's did change the people a little bit, but not going back all the way. His had more of an effect upon the people than what Hezekiah did. Neither one of them got them to truly go back to what they should have been, though. So while Hezekiah brought about a reform, God is now saying he's going to bring them down so that they once again will be Ariel, the altar of God. And that's kind of the idea that he's presenting. It shall be unto me as Ariel. You're going to be destroyed, you're going to be humbled, and thus you will be the altar of God once again. That gets us to verse 3 that we'll begin with, Lord willing, next week.